So as Federal in Bugger Ryan Ishkuji Keshton in January. I'm now taking leaders' questions under Standing Order 36. And again, Moshe the Hella, Clean na Shrianta Amma.
Gurmaigad Yaskin Corley agus Boyle and Foster File to Hurrivan Dell to the First Minister Michelle O'Neill and our MPs from the North who were elected to represent their constituencies, and I look forward to the day where they can rightfully take their seat in this House in a new and united Ireland. And in between, I would encourage the Government to revisit the commitment given by former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern in terms of providing speaking rights to those elected from the North. Yaskin Corley, the Charlie O'Hue la blocked in the lockdown Fullinch agus Yevni and Cora agus Adalshi and Ditch their entire Dina agus entire Tihiak and Maidsaw a visa when you go in Shishin Guru and we have to get Kulu horror and made Dini of Abalte Takiartel agus na Rosha their foil Kate van Gate Kuchu. The homeowners with defective concrete block scandal have continued to struggle with the failing redress scheme announced by this government since 2021. The scheme that failed to provide 100% redress as homeowners and their families face financial stress, they face mental anguish while they watch their homes crumble right around them. Children, Taoiseach, are forced to sleep in bedrooms with crumbling walls. Families are forced to live in unsafe conditions, and homeowners are facing massive shortfalls to rebuild their homes and their lives. Correspondence that's been released by the Ditch between the Attorney-General and the Minister for Housing from September 2021 reveals what Sinn Féin and the campaigners suspected from the very beginning, that there was a concerted effort at the very heart of government to block and limit financial support for those homeowners as their homes and lives crumbled right before their very eyes. The contents of the Attorney-General's letter to the Minister for Housing are shocking. The unwavering focus on ways to reduce the number of applicants to the redress scheme, and it shows the fact that he talked about that any improvements would likely increase the number of applicants to the scheme. An insinuation that affected homeowners would, in the Attorney-General's words, pitch their claims at the most generous basis that can be credibly advanced, end of quote. Rather than recognising that these are victims of a crisis where they are facing financial ruin and hardship and only ever wanted fairness, only ever wanted justice, only ever wanted a safe home for themselves and their children. The Attorney-General, in his correspondence, calls into question the competence of certified engineers, questioning their expertise and even claiming that they would be susceptible to pressure from homeowners and recommend anything other than was right or that they would be professionally recommending. He also questioned the expertise of local authority staff, Taoiseach. The contents of this correspondence are shocking, with the Attorney-General providing not just legal advice but policy advice on an issue that has destroyed so many lives. The Government has accepted much of the advice which limited financial support to so many homeowners. The disastrous consequences of this decision, Taoiseach, are only too well known by the victims of this scandal. Only 61 properties have been fully remediated to date, and that includes under the old scheme that was announced in 2018. The failures of the Government in responding to the defect scandal aren't surprising. The owners of nearly 16,000 apartments with emergency fire safety defects have yet to receive state funding despite the scheme opening since last year. And legislation meant to underpin a wider redress scheme for people with Celtic Tiger-era defects has still not been published despite commitments that it would be published last September. Your Government has failed homeowners affected by the defective concrete block scandal. The financial distress, but also the mental anguish that they face each and every day is proof of that failure. Taoiseach, the Attorney-General said in his advice that it was important to urgently engage with local solicitors to pursue the wrongdoers. In his advice, he mentioned quarries and block manufacturers. He said that there was considerable urgency with this. He went on to name Cassidy's quarry in Donegal, and he made it clear that the company going into liquidation could still be pursued and a claim made against them or their insurers. So can I ask you very simply, Taoiseach, on behalf of what 7,000 affected homeowners that's got concrete defects, can I ask you, why do you accept the Attorney-General's advice when it comes to actually limiting their ability to access this, but ignored the Attorney-General's advice when he told you now to urgently pursue the wrongdoers and naming some of those companies who were the wrongdoers, and you have done nothing about that since?
Hear, hear. Bána dúspáide fáilte a chuiridh príomhheada sa tuaisceart Michelle O'Neill agus buil Parliament na Breataine chuig ar dig. Ní ein tíim leis an méid atá ráite ag túsal Doherty, mar is sa léir go bhfuil annach chuid inistíoch chur a fáil ag an rialtas ó thaobh óníorí tuige nó taglaigh ina bhfuil annach chuid damáiste déanta de easca maice tá sús le gá bilún go leith inis chur ar fáil ag an rialtas don scéim seo. Agus scéim a bhd níos fearr ná an scéim a bhí ann henne 2009 agus scéimh ina raibh sin féin sásta le. Bhí sios sásta leis an scéim a bhí ann 2008 agus 2009. I just want to say I disagree fundamentally with the Deputy's presentation. Legal advice is always given to government on a whole range of issues. But the fundamental reality is, and I would have met with the representatives of micro-owners at the time as Taoiseach, and we dealt with many of the issues that they raised with us in respect of the deficiencies of the 218-219 scheme. And Sinn Féin supported and acquiesced with that 218-219 scheme. And Deputy O'Loughlin is on the record as saying that that scheme would suffice. But of course, it wasn't satisfactory. And that's why the government acted in terms of dramatically changing and transforming that schemes. And the enhanced scheme, which was legislated for in June of 2023, provide financial support to affected homeowners in Donegal, in Mayo, Limerick and Clare, and additionally now Sligo has been added. And grants of up to 420,000 are available for affected homeowners, depending on the works required under the scheme, and transitional arrangements for the transfer of applicants from the current scheme to the new, or the older scheme to the new scheme were also provided. And the enhanced scheme provides an evidence-based system for new counties or parts of counties to be designated as required. And you know, there's a lot of research and an extraordinary lot of work. And a report on the first 6 months of the operation of the scheme was recently prepared for the Minister. And it concluded that within the legislative framework set down by the Oireachtas, the scheme was operating satisfactorily. And indeed, the new scheme provides very substantial enhancements. 100% grants subject to an overall maximum grant of 420,000 per dwelling. Grant rates in keeping with advice from the Society of Chartered Surveyors. Government guarantee in the form of a second grant option if required for a period of up to 40 years. That wasn't in the previous scheme that Deputy O'Loughlin was happy with. A revised application process which removes the financial barrier to scheme entry. An independent appeals process for applicants. Alternative accommodation and storage costs and immediate repair works to a maximum value of 25,000, which people had asked for. The expertise of the housing agency in assessing applications. The inclusion of RTB registered rental properties, which hadn't been in the older scheme. The inclusion, as I said, of Clare and Limerick in the enhanced scheme upon commencement, and exempt development status for remediation works completed under the scheme. And the scheme is estimated, the costs are estimated at 2.3 billion. So I don't know how the Deputy can say the focus has been on limiting financial allocation to the scheme when the costs are estimated at about 2.3 billion, which by any objective yardstick is a very significant response by the government, and quite a significant number of applications. Up to the combined total amount paid to local authorities today is about 49.3 million, and about 1,644 applications had been received in the older scheme. They've transitioned to the new scheme, plus a further 514, and 821 of those were referred to the Housing Finance Agency.
Taoiseach, homeowners are telling you that the scheme isn't working. That's the nuts and bolts of this here. Everybody can tell you this. 1,300 people turned up in Inishowen telling us that the scheme wasn't working. 500 turned up in Mayo telling us the scheme wasn't working. The scheme is not working. It locks people out. And see this Attorney General's advice. I have it here. His advice was very clearly aimed at keeping people out of the scheme, trying to limit the exposure. And tell me this, Taoiseach, how's it legal advice for the Attorney General to call into question the competence of certified engineers? How's it legal advice for the Attorney General to call into competence the staff that we have working in our local authorities in Donegal or elsewhere? Riddle me that. The Attorney General wasn't given legal advice in a lot of this. It was actually policy advice. But where he did give legal advice in this chapter, chapter 23 of his legal advice, he says, I believe it's important to urgently engage competent local solicitors. He goes on to say, in terms of quarries, block manufacturers, he says there's considerable urgency with this because for any claims that are not statute barred, it would be necessary to issue proceedings urgently to avoid them being statute barred. He goes on to talk about Cassidy's quarries. He questions whether they're attempting to avoid liability by going into liquidation, but he says that even if they do go into liquidation, you can still pursue them. Now, I put it to you, 3 years on, Taoiseach, you have locked thousands of people out of this scheme, but 3 years on, what have you done to pursue the wrongdoers, the block manufacturers, the quarry manufacturers, that the Attorney General told you 3 years ago to urgently pursue?
We're over time. You're over time. No, Taoiseach, please, we're going to have to comply with the I don't mind a little leniency, but we're going to comply with the rules. Okay, Taoiseach.
First of all, we have locked nobody out of the scheme. And what I would say to the Deputy opposite, Sinn Féin and Deputy McLaughlin in particular gave, I admit, a cautious welcome to the previous scheme in January 2020, which compares in no shape or form to the new scheme that this government introduced, which is far more comprehensive, far more expansive, which deals with all of the issues that were raised with me when I first met with the group. And the policy response has been a very generous one, and there has to be an evidence-based approach to it, and the Society of Chartered Surveyors were brought in to look at the costs, all of the implications, and to make provision. I don't think there's a jurisdiction anywhere in Europe would have responded in the manner that we have responded here as a government. And also we've created further additionality in terms of the retrofit schemes and the SEAI, in terms of in any new remediation, the retrofitting facility is now available, which is additional again in terms of the scheme. So I deny, and I would reject, the assertions from Sinn Féin. And look, you haven't been on the ball on this for quite a long time. You never, for example, you've never replied. You never replied to a written request 2 months after the working group report was published. You never replied for some reason, giving your own detailed position on how the scheme. I think you guys dropped the ball a bit, you know.
Too embarrassed to even address the question.
I will not proceed in this manner. We're going to treat each other with dignity and respect. And listen, Deputy, I'm not going to repeat it. We're going to move on. Deputy Holly Cairns. Can we deal with the next speaker and listen, please? Thank you. Deputy Holly Cairns. Deputy Lawless.
I've asked the question twice. Not pursue the wrongdoers.
I can tell you.
I've asked the question twice.
Deputies, if this continues, I'm going to actually stop the Dáil. No, the apologies are not helpful at this point. We're going to move on with dignity and respect and listen to each other. Deputy Holland Cairns, uninterrupted.
Taoiseach, a leading paediatrician has issued a stark warning about the dire impacts of child homelessness. Dr. Aveen Walsh said children are presenting with rickets, anemia, faltering growth, extreme tooth decay and skin conditions like scabies. Children with autism or intellectual disabilities experience additional trauma from overcrowded, noisy emergency accommodation. She told the Irish Times they may be non-verbal, fecal smearing in hotel rooms, bedwetting, refusing to eat and not sleeping. Taoiseach, that there is an enormous body of research that tells us that homelessness is disastrous for children's health and well-being. As far back as 2019, a study from the RCSI warned that 40% of homeless children experienced clinically significant mental health and behavioural difficulties. At the time, that report rightly garnered major headlines and media attention. It was also raised repeatedly in this House. 5 years later, and Dr. Walsh's warnings about the catastrophic impact of homelessness on children have actually largely gone under the radar. She's concerned that as a society we are becoming numb to the appalling damage being done to children. Why? Because under this government, thousands of children in homelessness, is increasingly viewed not as a crisis, but as the norm. Because Taoiseach, there are now 4,316 children living in emergency accommodation, and at the end of this month, we will likely find that the figure has increased again. Since this government took office, the number of children in homelessness has increased by 63%. Never before have so many children in the state been without a secure home. And never before have children been spending so long in emergency accommodation. Of the nearly 1,500 families in emergency accommodation in Dublin in May, 26% of them had been homeless for 2 years or longer. Because once families enter homelessness, it's getting harder and harder to get them out. That is why we must stop children and families becoming homeless in the first place. Taoiseach, the new Labour government in the UK have said that it will ban no-fault evictions. This will leave us as one of the few countries in Europe where these evictions will still happen. Nobody who is a good tenant and who is paying their rent should be made homeless. If you really want to tackle child homelessness, prevent more children going into homelessness in the next week, in the next month, over the recess, why won't you stop this from happening?
Thank you.
Will you introduce a no-fault eviction ban?
Because I think that will make the situation even worse. I think supply is the key. And first of all, I want to acknowledge that without question, homelessness and emergency accommodation can be very detrimental to children's health and to people's health in general, but particularly children. And there's no argument there. And the response is not one of the norm. Rather, it is one of a multifaceted approach to, first of all, prevent people from becoming homeless in the first instance, and particularly families, and then secondly, exiting families and children in particular from homelessness as quickly as possible. And the Department of Housing worked with local authorities to bring an additional 2,000 beds into use in homeless emergency accommodation over the course of 2023. And during the first quarter of this year, about 650 households exited emergency accommodation. That's an increase of 7.2% on Q4 of 2023, and it's an increase of 18.5% on Q1 2023. And at the same time, during the same period, about over 1,000 households were prevented from entering emergency accommodation by way of a tenancy being created. That's a 59% increase on Q1 of 2023. And about close to 7,000 adult preventions and exits have been achieved over the course of 2023. And that's a 25% increase on what happened in 2022. So there's progress all in terms of the exiting and the prevention side of homelessness. And that will continue. The tenant in situ acquisition scheme has been particularly effective, with about number of preventions achieved increasing by more than 45%, partly as a result of the introduction of that scheme. Very substantial funding is being made available to specific homelessness-specific supports in terms of proper and far more supportive accommodation than hotels or anything like that. And the emergency and the family hubs in particular have been far more effective in that regard. And there's quite a substantial number of those. But nothing can be more advantageous to a child's health than the provision of a home. And supply is the key to that. And since the government came in, we've managed to facilitate the building of 110,000 homes. And last year, over 30,000, up to 12,000 last year in terms of delivery of social homes. And that is the key. Now, there are growing numbers, and in some instances coming into the country directly to avail of emergency accommodation from Europe. That happens. And in that context, you have a challenge in terms of under the framework not being eligible for social housing, but does require emergency accommodation. So there's many factors, but the key, in my view, is prevention and then rapid exit from homelessness as quickly as they can. And the most effective way to do that is supply of more houses.
So this week, a primary school teacher told me about an incredibly upsetting incident in their classroom. This week, a primary school teacher told me about an incredibly upsetting incident in their classroom where they asked the children to draw out their house and mark the name of the rooms as Gaeilge. And one child got very upset and whispered to their teacher that they couldn't do the exercise because they didn't have a home. That is one of the 4,316 children who are homeless. The damage that's been caused as a result of this will be lifelong. The upset, the stress, the lack of proper nutrition, the cramped and unsuitable accommodation, the noise, the inability to have friends come over to play, the lack of security, the lack of a home is causing major trauma. And you'd swear from your reply that there wasn't a 63% increase in child homelessness since this government took office. Where is the urgency? That with that backdrop and that context, you just dismiss the desperate need for a ban on no-fault evictions without being able to explain why Ireland is so different to every other country in Europe is outrageous.
Thank you, Deputy.
Taoiseach, you say banning evictions for people who pay this rent would cause chaos or make the situation worse. Can you explain how it's the norm across Europe and Ireland is somehow different?
Deputy, I don't dismiss anyone's arguments. I don't dismiss any issue. And I think there should be an acceptance and an acknowledgement that elected representatives in this House, irrespective of party, have the same degree of concern and urgency about the homelessness crisis and housing crisis as you do or anybody else do. And this attempt, and what I would say is that part of the issue in terms of how and if you look at the Housing Commission, report, for example, it talks about the reactive policies of the Oireachtas and governments, it says, to the rental market. I would include the policies of your party as part of that reactive approach, which would reduce the amount of rental properties available, which would make the housing supply problem worse, and which would make the homelessness issue worse. We have witnessed over the last while an increased number of people exiting the rental market, as in terms of people with houses or who had houses for rent pulling out because of the kind of initiatives and proposals that you've put forward. We need to expand the rental market and the supply in the rental market, not depress it. And we need to do that on a number of fronts.
Thank you, Taoiseach. We're moving on. Tá méid bogar rai go dtí an tríú ceist ón i January an grúpa ragúnach i cheachta Peter Fitzpatrick.
As recently as 5 years ago, Ireland was being celebrated within the EU for road safety, following a reduction in fatalities of over 40%. Yet this week, Ireland's road deaths toll hit 100 people, meaning the overall number now is 40% higher than last year, and we are just over halfway through the year. 2024 is on course to prove the most lethal for traffic fatalities in 15 years. My colleague here from Waterford, a lady there on Tuesday, 70-year-old lady, was in collision with a lorry. You know, it's happening in every consistency, Taoiseach. Taoiseach, we just need to get enforcement. Given the rise in the fatal road tragedy collisions, the force must continue to adopt its policing initiatives to increase safety on Irish roads. Taoiseach, I would acknowledge that a great deal of progress has been made via April Road Traffic Act passing into law. This law saw an increased focus on guard enforcement, with every uniformed officer now spending 30 minutes per shift on visible road policing. However, in my constituency alone, in last week, there was 3-car accident at Balogan petrol station, an accident just before the exit 17 northbound, and a car and a caravan hit each other and caused significant damage. This is causing a lot of tragedy in local communities. The three main aims, Taoiseach, is speeding, drink and drugs. And this is a massive challenge to our time. Since 2019, people between the ages of 16 and 25 represented by 20% of all road deaths, despite making up just 12% of the population. This trend is sadly continued in 2024. Taoiseach, the reason behind problematic behaviour in young people is quite complex and multifactional. We must invest in a more evidence-based approach to understanding problematic driver behaviour and provide greater education through public awareness campaign. In addition to enforcement, reform of all driving test regimes. We need to invest seriously in our infrastructure improvement. Minister, Taoiseach, is the RSA budget fit for purpose? I see Ms O'Donnell of the RSA certainly doesn't believe so, and she's saying that need a lot more investment. Also, Taoiseach, the provision of crash data to our local authorities, are we giving them the information that they need in providing to help the safety measurements? Driver behaviour needs to be challenged, both in education, engineering and enforcement and sanctions. Taoiseach, I would ask you, would you please liaise with the Minister for Transport to ensure adequate funding is provided to the RSA towards enforcement and towards research and education campaign to reduce dangerous driving? For example, Taoiseach, in 2006, the random checkpoints came in, and Taoiseach, it put the fear of God in everybody. It worked. So I'm just going to say we need to put more initiatives. Every life lost on the roads is a tragedy, Taoiseach.
First of all, I want to thank the Deputy for raising this very serious issue in respect of road safety. We've all been shocked by the recent loss of life on our roads and concerned by the worrying increase in road fatalities because as of the 11th of July, 188 road fatalities have occurred in 2023. In 2024, as of 11th of July, 101. Which is about 14 up in the same period last year. And I think we need a multifaceted response. We had far worse figures in the past. And I remember when Noel Dempsey was Minister for this area, he set in train a dramatic series of proposals with the establishment of the Road Safety Authority, the late Gay Byrne chairing it at the time, and they brought about a radical reduction in the loss of lives and injuries on our roads. And the lesson from that is we can do it. And we can, if we rededicate ourselves and act proactively, legislatively, on the deterrents that you're suggesting, and also properly understanding what's going on at the moment, that we can deal with this, we can get these numbers down. And you mentioned speed, you mentioned drink, you mentioned drugs and behaviour. And those are issues that have to be tackled. Now, the Road Traffic Act of 2024 was signed into law on the 17th of April last. And that dealt with three main issues: penalty point system reform, mandatory drug testing at the scene of serious collisions, and that began on the 31st of May ahead of the bank holiday, of the June bank holiday, and the implementation of safer default speed limits as recommended by the speed limit review. And it's expected that those speed limit measures will be introduced later in this year on local roads. And again, one of the challenges in road safety legislation and initiatives is it very often they meet criticism or they meet opposition on the ground. And this has always been the challenge. And I think we have to be very determined as a society that we have to reduce the number of people being killed on our roads, the number of children being killed on our roads. And the development of the National Road Safety Camera Strategy, that will be an important step towards road safety. As part of the budget, funding has been made available for the Go Safe speed cameras, continuing the increased level of 9,000 hours monitoring a month throughout the whole of 2024. We all have a stake in this, as citizens. We all have to watch our own behaviour. The uniformed members of An Garda Síochána now, all of them are carrying out 30 minutes of high visibility roads policing per shift. And in May last, the Garda Síochána officially launched a system for identifying uninsured vehicles by scanning or entering the vehicle registration on the Garda Mobility device. And we will significantly increase spending on public awareness and communication by the Road Safety Authority, as you said, is necessary, and we will continue to support the authority, and the forthcoming estimates reflect that.
Deputy Fitzpatrick.
Thank you very much. Taoiseach, our roads are not safe. And Taoiseach, please listen, our footpaths are not safe. You can't even go on a footpath now with e-scooters and bicycles. Our loved ones are passing away. These are things that can be prevented. Like our behaviour. Like Taoiseach, when we were children, Taoiseach, we were roughly about the same age. You can go to your front door, you can play a bit of football in the streets. Them days are all gone. There's no respect anymore, Taoiseach. What I'm trying to say, Taoiseach, is we have to get enforcement. We have to get sanctions. And the Garda plays a big part in it. I live in the Doherty area for the last number of years. I don't know when the last time I was stopped. I was in a checkpoint. I'm lucky enough I don't drink and I pay my tax in my car. I don't have a problem. But the enforcement, it just seems it's completely and utterly stopped. It's totally and utterly wrong. So what I'm trying to say to you is, Tánaiste, is we need action. Like, you know, like people, children go out at night time, and we're all hoping that they come home. We're hoping that they're knocking on the doors, you know, police coming in and saying, listen, your children. Prevention is the best cure. A lot of money has been invested at the moment. The roads has improved. But Tánaiste, drugs, speed and drink. If we don't do something, and the Gardaí has to play a big part. And I'm just saying, and it's up to yourself and for the Minister and everything to get it done. So Tánaiste, please help stop all these young people from dying.
To respond.
Thank you.
I think behaviour is at the centre of this, and you referenced an earlier era, although we sometimes look back with rose-tinted glasses at the 70s and so on. There was more people killed on our roads then, with far less cars than today, which speaks about that era and the lack of proactive safety measures, which is why what we did in the late 90s and early 2000s in particular, when Dempsey was Minister at the time, that had impact. So we need to kind of rediscover that. The drugs issue is an issue, and Minister Jack Chambers did move on that in terms of the mandatory drug testing. And that's an increasingly parallel with alcohol, is as prevalent an issue now than it would have been in earlier eras, and is impacting on road safety. So I think at all levels, human behaviour levels, on Garda Síochána, strengthening the legislation on limits and so on like that, but also in terms of the whole national road safety sort of camera framework and so forth. All of that is required to get these numbers down, and we will continue to work on it, Deputy. And thank you for raising it.
Ag bog Ryan Ishkuji an Cheist Yarnock and Choctor Deputy Richard Donohue.
Thank you, Lars Concorla. Tánaiste, in 2020, for €100, you got 16.5 gallons of fuel in 2020. Today, that same 16.5 gallons of fuel now costs you €139.42. In 2020, for the €100 of fuel, you were taking €45 tax in diesel, you were taking €50 tax per 100 in petrol. Today, you are taking 62.74 in diesel, and you're taking 69.71. So for a gallon of fuel, which we were paying the same product for, and we're getting the same product today, you now have an increase per €100, or in 16.5 gallons of fuel, you have an increase in tax in diesel on 17.74 and in petrol 29.71. Even though we're getting the same product, we're paying €40 more per 100 for the same product, but you're taking 29.71 extra in taxes in petrol and 17.74 extra in diesel. This then has a knock-on effect for food producers, transport network around this country. Then we go to the hospitality sector, where the VAT rate was at 9%. We then had the minimum wage increase, which I welcomed, and I do. And then the government put the VAT rate back up to 13.5%. So left people no other option but to rise the price of their product, when they could have absorbed it if the VAT rate was left at 9% in the hospitality, which would have absorbed the increases. But no, you put back on 4.5% VAT and the increase, which means the cost of your lunch one time was €10. You're now paying €15 or €15.50 for the same lunch to absorb a cost because of the taxes changing. I use a business model for everything that I do, and I want businesses to survive. And common sense tells you that if you're putting in one thing like raising a wage, you have to absorb it somewhere. But by putting up the taxes, it actually dilutes or actually gets rid of the increase that you were given in the first place. So increase the minimum wage, but then you increase the product that they're trying to buy and trying to live. You've actually created inflation. But by reducing the tax rate back, which gives you back the same tax margin, because the cost of the product has gone up, you've less tax to take. That means that they actually get more for their money. That's common sense. That's a business model. People are in crisis in this country, working every day an hour. What to do what? To pay extra taxes. So what I'm asking to know is, will you please look at the VAT rate of 9%, to reduce the VAT rate at 9% for the hospitality sector? You can leave it at 13.5% on a bedroom stay, but reduce it for the working person.
I thank the Deputy for raising the issue. A number of issues there, I think. One, in terms of the petrol and diesel excise rates, and then the VAT on hospitality. And as you know, to take the first one, I mean, the government is very acutely aware of the impacts of energy price inflation and the broader cost of living crisis on households and businesses. Now, perhaps you didn't get an opportunity to dwell on the work that government has done, and I would argue government has acted decisively to lessen the impacts of inflation, including 12 billion euros in supports today to citizens to try and offset the cost of living caused by the energy crisis consequential on the war in Ukraine and the return or the post-COVID period. And in budget 2024 alone, it provided for 2.7 billion in once-off cost of living measures, including targeted welfare interventions, electricity account credits, the energy credits, reducing VAT on electricity and gas, and reduced public transport fares. And we also in 2022 had provided for temporary reductions in the excise rates of 21% and 16% per litre on petrol and diesel. Now, the good news is that fuel prices have fallen considerably, thanks be to God, from their highs of 2022, when a litre of petrol and diesel cost between euro 10 cents and 2.20, compared with between 1.69 and 1.77 today. And a barrel of crude oil on global markets costs $84, well below the highs of more than $110 experienced during much of 2022. And inflation, consumer inflation has eased from a peak of 9.6% in 2022 to 1.5% in June, all of which is positive news. And in terms of the summer economic statement, we're proposing to put 1.4 billion aside for tax, and we're looking at expenditure increase year on year of about 6.9%. Now, that's very significant, Deputy, by any yardstick. Now, we have provided for tax reductions over the last 4 years of government. The preference of the three parties in government, Fine Gael and the Greens, is to maintain a focus on the personal taxation front. In terms of, so wages have increased. If we don't do anything with the personal taxation framework, you essentially would be taxing people. But to enable us to keep pace with wages and to make sure people are not taxed, that could cost up to 1.1 billion alone. We're being warned left, right and centre not to overheat the economy. So choices will have to be made. But the preference of the three parties is clearly on the personal taxation front. The cost of a full-scale VAT reduction would be about 750 million on top of your 1.4. Or if you were to try and do food alone, it's estimated around 550 million. So these are the choices that government will have to make.
Thank you, Taoiseach. In 2020, it was 120 euros a square foot to build a house. Today, it's somewhere between anywhere from 180 to 200 euros a square foot. On the taxes alone, on 23% on a 2,000 square foot house, you were taking an extra 4,600 euros in VAT. Now you're taking 9,200 euros because the same base cost for that house has gone from 240,000 plus VAT to 380,000 plus VAT for the same house. Same house, but you're taking more tax. So what is happening here is you work in this country, you pay tax. You don't qualify for anything. So what I'm looking for is a reward here for somebody that worked. I'm talking about people that go out and work, pay for their mortgage, pay for their house, and are no burden to the state. And these people work for the vulnerable people, for the people that can't work, and they have no problem with that. All they want is a reward system, that they have something left at the end of the week that they can say, listen, I have something. And they don't complain. But there's no reward for a person in this country that works. That's what I'm trying to say to you. They're taxed out of existence, no matter what way they go.
Thank you.
Oh, no, I mean, the government is reducing the tax on workers. We're reducing income tax for workers. We've reduced USC. Universal Social Charge last year. So the focus has been reducing income tax to give people more disposable income to enable them to spend at their discretion. That has been the focus of government over the last 4 years. We've also reduced the cost of services in terms of transport, in terms of education. The free book scheme has been a tremendous help to parents in terms of the school expenditure. We've abolished hospital admission charges. We've dramatically increased access to GP care, the biggest increase in access to GP care ever, which again reduces costs. The drug payment scheme reduced. A whole range of reductions in the cost of public services, parallel with consistent reductions in personal taxation. Now, you seem to want us not to reduce the taxes for workers, but rather reduce it elsewhere. And I mean, I don't know whether you believe we should have a 2 billion tax package or a 2.5 billion tax package. You need to perhaps specify what your priorities are. But our priority is to reduce taxes for workers, to enable workers to have more disposable income to spend on services at their discretion and on what their families want to, prioritise.